agriculture, Mr. President, marami talaga problema ang agrikultura. Marami talaga. From the lack of inputs, the lack of know-how, the lack of training, the lack of modernization.
Alright, shoutout po mga kababayan po natin at isang mapagpalang araw po sa ating lahat. Narito po tayo para sa ating panibagong update. At kaugnay nga po mga kababayan po natin, itong bagong niratify ng Senado mga kababayan po natin. So ito po yung RCEP. Ano po ba yung RCEP? Ang RCEP ay the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, is a free trade agreement among the Asia-Pacific nation like Australia, Brunei, Colombia, China, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, New Zealand, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, at Vietnam. So mostly nasa Asia po ito mga kababayan. So ito yung RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, kung saan mga kababayan po natin ay kinokontra nga ng ilang lehitimong organisasyon ng mga magsasaka mga kababayan po natin. Dahil ito umano ang papatay sa ating mga magsasaka. Dahil aasa umano yung ating gobyerno sa mga importation mga kababayan po natin, import product. So kaya nga naman itong pro-agriculture or pro-magsasaka mga kababayan po natin, na itong si Senator Imee Marcos ay hindi pumayag mga kababayan po natin. Pero majority ng mga senador po natin ay naging pabor. Siyempre, unang-una, itong si Zubiri pa naman yung sumusulong, at itong isa, si Legarda mga kababayan po natin. Asaan yung sinasabi ng ating Pangulo na magkaroon po tayo ng sustainable na agrikultura? So paano kung aasa na lang tayo sa importation? Sibuyas, asukal, pati asin import. So ngayon pati yung mga pangunahing agrikulturang produkto po natin ay i-import umano mga kababayan po natin. Kaya nga naman ay kinontra ito ni Senator Imee Marcos, kagaya nung rice tariffication, which is mas dumadami ang mga import na bigas, hindi naman nagiging mura yung bigas sa ating bansa. So ibig sabihin, itong mga batas na pinapasa ngayon ay hindi naman umano paraan para magiging bumaba itong mga pangunahing agricultural product sa ating bansa. Ito umano ay magpapahirap pa sa ating mga magsasaka mga kababayan po natin. So para maunawaan po natin, pakinggan po natin itong debate ni Senator Imee Marcos versus sa dalawang mukong na ito, na si Zubiri at si Legarda mga kababayan po natin, na ngayon ang magsasaka ay nanggigigil sa dalawang ito dahil sila umano yung magpapahirap sa mga lehitimong magsasaka po natin mga kababayan.
Subject of my own committee, but which I am grateful to the Senate President as well as the Senate President pro tempore for taking over. But in fact, questions remain in my mind as well as they do in many others. And first, I would like to state, quoting the Senate President, that international bodies and organizations such as the ADB, the World Bank, the UNCTAD have recognized the immense value and importance of the RCEP, especially in the post-pandemic recovery. However, it should be observed that the UNCTAD itself, in a research paper by Dr. Nishita, indicated that tariff concessions under the RCEP will result in lower exports by the Philippines, completely the opposite claim by the administration. The study shows that the overall effect of RCEP will be a decrease in Philippine exports by $100 million. In another study by Boston University, Rashmi Banga et al., it was shown that Philippine exports will decline by 0.2% and imports would rise by 0.2% at the very least. Even with the sensitive lists of tariff rate quotas, as mentioned by our colleague in the annexes, by Senator Chis Escudero, the paper estimated that the Philippines' balance of trade in goods will deteriorate by a minimum of 1.1% or a loss of USD 260 million per annum. So it will get quite a bit worse before it gets any better. All these losses on top of an estimated $58 million in tariff revenue losses annually. Are these figures accurate? Do you have any comment? Because I know the DTI, the DA, and the other economic managers' projections are different.
So, ayun mga kababayan, no, ayon dito sa mga research nga na nakuha ni Senator Amy Marcos, mga kababayan po natin, imbis na tataas po yung ating import, ay bababa pa yung ating export, mga kababayan po natin. Imbis na tataas yung ating export ibig sabihin tayo yung nagpapadala ng mga agricultural product po natin sa ibang bansa. Imbis baliktad, mga kababayan po natin, mas tataas yung pag-i-import po natin. So, ibig sabihin, pag ganun yung mangyayari, ay walang positibong impact ito para sa ating bansa. Kundi ang mangyari, mas maraming pumapasok na mga imported na produkto, mga kababayan po natin, mas lalong mahihirapan at mas mahal yung bilihin dahil nga maraki ang gasto sa mga importation kaysa mga local na produkto po natin. Plus, dahil kung babaha yung mga produktong pang-agrikultura sa ating bansa dahil sa RCEP na ito, di yung mga farmers po natin, ano pang purpose nila? Ano pang ibebenta nila kung mayroon namang produkto na galing na nga sa ibang bansa, mas magandang quality, syempre, puno sa gamot, dahil sa pag-import yan, mga kababayan po natin, ay alam mo natin, pagka ganitong kalakaran, import ang pag-uusapan, tiba-tiba yung DE dyan, mga kababayan po natin. Tiba-tiba yung Department of Agriculture at ang Custom. So, alam na natin kung ano ang kanilang purpose. Hindi para sa mga mahihirap na Pilipino, bagkus para mapunot ang kanilang bulsa. Mga kababayan natin. So, ano naman yung paliwanag ni Zubiri dito?
Well, Your Honor, first of all, good afternoon, Your Honor. Mr. President, I always say the proof in the pudding is in the eating. Diba? All these studies were made prior to RCEP's ratification on all these other countries. But we have seen in the region, Mr. President, I mentioned it yesterday and in my speech last week, exports in RCEP countries increased, particularly Vietnam, 16.4% with a total value of $108 billion. Nag-increase. And you know, we're trying to catch up with Vietnam because parang Vietnam is now our peg when we try to get foreign direct investments from other countries. It's always either the Vietnam or Philippines ang gusto nilang puntahan. Second, Thailand, Your Honor, it increased by 7.1% in 2022 alone, soon as they had ratified their treaty. That's about $300 billion, Mr. President. And these are trade to RCEP countries, Mr. President. These are not trade to other nations, Europe or all. These are trade to RCEP countries. In Cambodia, they went up to 4% in 2022. At $31 billion, Mr. President. And I'd like to take note, there's an increase of 17.6% in exports in garments alone to Australia with a total of $102 million. The other day, nasa Inquirer po, $6.5 million trade deal with Japan on garments. Ito po, $102 million on Australia alone because of RCEP. So ang laki compared to what we were getting in other countries because I presume it is cheaper to produce it within the RCEP family and to export it because of less tariffs. Malaysia, Mr. President, exports grew by 25%. Can you imagine that, Mr. President? 25%. RCEP countries, and in 2022, it accounted for 58% of total trade of Malaysia. And the list goes on, Mr. President. Before you know it, pati Laos, baka matalo pa tayo sa Laos and even Myanmar.
So, yun nga mga kababayan, yung binabasihan, kung napapansin nyo po, yung binabasihan lahat dito ni Zubiri ay itong mga ibang bansa, mga kababayan po natin, na progresibo ang kanilang mga agricultural product, mga kababayan po natin. Suportado ng gobyerno, mas tinutukan ng ating gobyerno, mga kababayan po natin. Yung kasi yung una nilang binigyan ng priority. Bakit hindi mo nabigyan ng priority itong mga magsasaka po natin? Tutukan mo na sila, bigyan ng subsidiya, bigyan ng mga makabagong kagamitan sa pagsasaka para mas mabilis ang kanilang production. Kasi kung mangyayari na parang free trade po tayo, so ibig sabihin mababa yung taripa, mas mabilis makapasok ang importasyon sa ating bansa dahil sa batas na ito. Ano pang gana ngayon ng farmers magtatrabaho? Marami pumapasok ng mga imported na produkto, pero hindi sila makapagsaka ng maayos dahil kulang sila sa kagamitan. Mahal ang abono, mahal ang labor. Bakit hindi sila bigyan nito mga bagong kagamitan na kaya nilang mag-produce ng kanilang farmers na konti lang ang labor na kailangan, di ba?
An example, China-Philippines bilateral trade increased by 8.3% during the first 11 months of 2022, a clear recovery from the pandemic. We were not members of RCEP, but that uptick was very clear-cut. Philippine exports to South Korea increased by 16.9% again during the same period of the first 3 quarters of 2022, where in fact both South Korea and China are RCEP members, and still the Philippines was not. In fact, our increase in trade was greater than these examples stated of Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam without RCEP.
But Madam President, just to Mr. President, let's go to the flip side. The flip side is if we don't join RCEP and we stay isolationist in this region, you think the people that we talked to in Japan last weekend with the president, your brother, will they want to go to the Philippines and expand their trade here? They can take it to Vietnam. They can take it to Cambodia. They can take it to other countries that are within the RCEP because it's more advantageous to them. So the flip side there is, okay, because we're afraid that our exports may go down, and therefore let's not join RCEP. The flip side there is all those who want to expand that are already exporting now will just go to an RCEP member country. And I introduced you last week with a company that wants to build 2,000 e-vehicles. It's an EVT company. It's the biggest e-vehicle company listed in the NASDAQ. Their choice is between Singapore, Johor, or the Philippines. Singapore, why? Because the headquarters in Singapore, the manufacturing will be in Johor. And they held on to the contract signing because they wanted to visit the Philippines. And I brought them here last week. Obviously, it would be more advantageous for them to go to Singapore, Johor if we do not join the RCEP. Because they also want to sell these vehicles within the RCEP regions, not only the United States. So the flip side there is that we don't join RCEP, definitely we will not be able to expand the exports. We will not have a hard time convincing these people to come in and do foreign direct investment in our country. That's the long and short of it.
Mr. President, I would like to respond to the chairman of the
Yes.
Foreign Relations Committee.
Before you embark on your explanation,
Yes.
Senate President Pro Tempore, I'm very grateful for you taking over this bill. I have deep and immense gratitude for that.
Thank you so much, and I would like to put on record that I consulted Her Honor before I took on the responsibility when my name was mentioned as subcommittee chair. Well, I was out of the session hall, but I heard my name being mentioned. And as part of the leadership of the chamber, I do not shirk from the responsibility, however challenging. And I asked Your Honor very clearly, Sen.Imee, whom I regard very highly as knowledgeable, having vast experience in governance as well, what is wrong with RCEP, convinced me that I should not take it. And Your Honor had told me there is nothing wrong with RCEP. It is smuggling. It is the way there's been lack of support for the agriculture sector and similar issues. And so I accepted it. I said, okay, then I will take on that responsibility to the best of my ability. And then I studied it. But I am grateful for the very clarificatory questions that you are posing, because a 10.47 increase in exports and 2.2 0.02% increase in real GDP. Of course, I agree with you. These are studies, these are statistics, these are numbers. We can listen to Banga, to Kimba, to several experts here, and I feel for you. We share the same advocacies. We've talked about it privately. And yung pangamba nyo, pangamba din po natin. Matutuwa po kayo na meron tayong ginawang bago na inobasyon.
Ang ganda ng linya ni mga kababayan ni Loren Pangamba nyo ay pangamba din namin. Hindi ang pangamba namin ay hindi nyo pangamba, wala naman kayong pakialam diyan .
On innovation in our concurring resolution, which I will read into the record later, are provisions and resolutory clauses that hopefully everybody, including those who are against the RCEP treaty as is, that will mandate and task our agencies whose cabinet members are present here with us today to work on specific sectors so that whatever possibility of adverse impact on that sector will be buffered by the provisions in our resolutory clauses.
So, yun nga mga kababayan at yun nga ang sinasabi kasi dito ni Senator Loren Legarda, mga kababayan po natin, ay malaki itong tulong para sa ating bansa. At yung sabi niya nga na ang wino-worry daw ng lahat ay wino-worry niya rin, hindi tayo sigurado diyan sa sinasabi niya, mga kababayan po natin. Alam naman natin itong si Senator Loren Legarda talaga hindi ko alam kung may concern ba ito sa taong bayan. Hindi ko alam kung bakit tuloy-tuloy pa rin itong nananalo, mga kababayan po natin.
Malaking parte pa rin nandyan sa akin. But we cannot be left behind, as the Senate President so clearly mentioned, because of all the ASEAN nations, we are the only country, Mr. President, who has not ratified this. And as I mentioned yesterday, pag merong nag-export ng tsokolate mula sa Indonesia, mula sa nagtatanim ng kakao, at binabana ng Japan ang taripa dahil RCEP country siya, paano na yung ating mga gustong mag-export ng tsokolate, base na rin sa local kakao natin, kung hindi tayo sasama ng RCEP dahil zero na ang taripa within 16 years, pag RCEP country ka, pag hindi, ay malaki, 24.3%, 23% ang taripa. Bibilin ba ng mga Hapon ang tsokolate mula Indonesia o ang tsokolate galing Pilipinas, base na rin sa cacao farmers sa Mindanao, sa iba-ibang lugar, kung hindi ganung kababa ang presyo. Isang pahayag lang po yan. Sabi nga ni Senator, wag nang mahaba ang mga sagot ko, kaya lang ko. Pag kay Senator Marcos, dahil sinangguni ko siya bago tanggapin ko ang aking tungkulin sa trabahong ito na hindi madali. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yes, respectful of the deadlines imposed upon this House as well as on the Senate President, may I just raise the following questions by way of manifestation that the sponsors may or may not answer. We are repeatedly told everywhere we go that we are the last country to ratify this trade agreement, this treaty. However, the reality is, at the outset, a major economy refused to even join the discussion. Is it not a fact that India did not join RCEP precisely because of concerns similar to ours here in the Philippines on threats of circumvention of rules of origin, issues of trade deficit, and the potential flood of imported goods? We share the same problems with India, except they're much bigger and they're much stronger. And what about that growing trade deficit? Not projected, but actually recorded already in several countries. This is a major concern po. I would also like to mention that a statement was made by the sponsors that adequate safety nets are provided in the agreement to cover unwarranted or exceptional circumstances. May I simply say that these supposedly sufficient safeguards are no safeguards at all, simply because the success rate for successfully defending Article 20 of the GATT and the Article 14 of the GATT, the Services Agreement, is less than 3%. A study in 2015 reveals that out of 43 cases involving Article 20 of GATT and Article 14
So, ito mga kababayan na tinitingnan natin sa RCEP, ano, na itong kinokontra nga ni Senator Imee Marcos, mga kababayan po natin, na kung itong RCEP ay mas makatulong sa ating bansa. So, pabor tayo dyan, mga kababayan po natin. So, titingnan po natin ito, ano, na sana hindi itong batas na ito, hindi sana ito magpapahirap sa ating mga Pilipino at lalong-lalo na sa mga magsasaka po natin. Na tama sana itong sinasabi ni Senator Legarda na tataas yung ating export. Pero kung tataas pa yung ating import, ay naku, wag na lang. Mag-withdraw na lang sila dyan. Kasi kung ang mangyayari ay aasa na lang tayo sa imported na produkto, abay, kawawa naman yung mga magsasaka po natin. Sino pa yung bibili ng mga local produce po natin? Eh kung puro naman imported ang bumabaha sa mga local na merkado. Wala na.
We are also aware of the loss of jobs everywhere in many of these areas. These are my concerns, and I am grateful to the President, to the majority, for allowing me to put them on record. The sponsors may or may not reply as necessary, but I have to put them on record for the concerned sectors. Thank you very much, po.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I deeply appreciate the points made by our distinguished colleague, Senator Imee Marcos, and just in broad strokes, Mr. President, to just come up with a very short, I'll try to shorten it as possible in the answers. The issue in agriculture, well, first of all, the issue in India. I mentioned yesterday my geopolitical, my geopolitical issue. India and China don't like each other. Actually, they beat each other up every time in the border of India and China. India now is slowly gaining in terms of population. They're actually going to be probably this year the biggest population in the world. They're going to surpass China very, very soon. And so I think they're worried about opening up their markets to China, which is a more sophisticated, has a more sophisticated manufacturing system, which probably they feel in India they cannot compete with, no? Especially with the larger population that's growing in India. They might lose out on these markets. On the issue of agriculture, Mr. President, marami talaga problema ang agrikultura. Marami talaga. From the lack of inputs, the lack of know-how, the lack of training, the lack of modernization.
O di ba mga kababayan po natin? Aminado naman sila, yung mga senador po natin, na maraming problema pagdating sa agrikultura. Eh bakit hindi tutukan at bakit hindi tulungan at hindi na lang puro salita, mga kababayan po natin?
Of our equipments and machineries, even land concerns. Kasi overlapping po yung issues on land dyan sa agriculture. Napakahirap. Kung gusto po natin, sabihin natin sa San Miguel Corporation, pwede ba kayo magtanim ng 1,000 or 10,000 hectares of land? And I know there was a Brazilian group that went to the president asking for 10,000 hectares of land to present to the president the real modern way of sugar agriculture to include ethanol and biofuels and biomass para 4 products in 1 for sugarcane. Alam niyo po, ang totoo dyan, nandiyan po si ES, nag-usap kami dyan, napakahirap maghanap ng lupa dahil overlapping ang mga may-ari nitong lupang ito. Agrarian Reform Beneficiaries, NCIP communities, talaga napakahirap maghanap ng lupa para magtanim ng farms na yon, lalo na corporate farms. And we're very restrictive when it comes to corporate farms because the agrarian reform law is still in place, and they'd rather give it to beneficiaries rather than our farmers. No, so I mean, other than corporate farming, I just want to put on record Thailand spends double in their agriculture than Philippines, double. So maybe in the next budget cycle, with the help of Senator Imee, with the help of all of us here, let's double the budget of agriculture and let's make sure that it goes to the right programs. I totally agree with you. And that's the only way to do it. But at least I'd like to point for the record, Nandito din sa smuggling issue. Nandito si Commissioner Rubio. Nandiyan ba? Nandito si Commissioner Rubio to show his brand new, newly minted, to show that we are going to weigh in heavily on the smugglers and try to apprehend them. So, yun lamang po, Mr. President, on BRICS, I just came out with big strokes.
So, yun nga mga kababayan, ano, nabanggit pa itong si Rubio. Yan nga yung sangkot din sa Tara Collection, mga kababayan po natin, na nai-appoint ni Pangulong ni Pangulong Marcos. Mga kababayan po natin, may anomalya nga rin yan si Rubio, pagdating sa corruption diyan Tara sa custom po natin, pero nai-appoint pa rin ang ating Pangulo without further investigation. At bakit na-promote yan? Bakit na lagay diyan sa custom? May anomalya nga, mga kababayan po natin. So agree po tayo dito. Ito yung nagustuhan natin kay Zubiri, mga kababayan po natin. Sa sunod na taon dito sa Senate hearing po natin sa pag-budget ay dapat dublihin ang budget ng Department of Agriculture. Tama yan, dublihin, pero sana ay wag kurakutin. Kasi nakita natin ngayon, mga kababayan po natin, marami ang kurakot ngayon sa administrasyon ni Pangulong Bongbong Marcos Jr., mga kababayan po natin. Sa custom, yung usapan nitong mga smuggler, ang kasabuatan nito sa Department of Agriculture, nitong mga hoarder. So nakita nyo ba yan, mga kababayan po natin, na talagang masyadong talamak sila, na halatang halata kasi ordinaryong tao nabibisto yung kanilang mga ideolohiya, yung mga kanilang diskarte, mga kababayan po natin. So dito sa sinasabi nating RCEP, itong bago niratify ng Senado, mga kababayan po natin, na sana totoo itong prediction o parang pag-aaral ni Zubiri na ito ay makakabuti sa ating bansa. Mas tataas yung ating export, mga kababayan po natin. Mas dadami yung ating investors, mga kababayan po natin. Sana ganon ang mangyayari. At kung hindi rin naman, ay mas mainam na mag-pull out na lang kung mamamatay din naman yung ating mga farmers dahil sa pagdami ng pagpasok dito mga imported na produkto dahil dito sa RCEP, mga kababayan po natin. At sana sa huli ay wag natin kalimutan yung mga farmers natin. Lagi nating susuportahan. Wag patayin yung mga farmers po natin kagaya ng nangyari dito sa issue ng sibuyas. So dapat papanagutin itong mga talagang gumagawa ng kasamaan, lalo na pagsabotahe sa ating ekonomiya. So wala naman tayo narinig kung may nakasuhan na ba talaga o hindi. Pero sinabi naman ni Zubiri dito na kung hindi epektibo ay magpupula ito. So aasahan po natin, aantayin po natin kung ano magiging resulta nitong RCEP na ito. Pero isa lang nasisigurado natin, parang magiging rice therapy.